lot of people think it's all glamour and it's all this and celebrities.
No, I mean, you're a commodity, right? You're something that the studio owns. And so, really, as long as you survive filming and they've gotten what they needed from you, they don't really care if you drop dead afterwards. It doesn't matter. Do you break an arm, break a leg? And, things like when you're working, you can get really sick. As long as you're not bleeding from your face, you're going to keep working, and people don't understand that. And then in terms of, there's no regard for your physical safety or well-being at all, because it doesn't matter, because you're a means to an end. So they need what they need from you, and then goodbye. Suck it up, tough it up, and we'll see you for the next one. And so that's what I mean by it being sort of morally bankrupt, is there's just no empathy or concern for humanity, or God forbid, like recognition of a spirit. That doesn't, in my experience, from my perspective, I haven't experienced that in this industry. There's not a lot of concern for what's right for individuals.
Jordan Peterson, thanks for joining us. We've got a long list of statistics that paint a pretty clear picture that boys seem to be falling behind relative to girls in the United States. Why do you think that is?
I think that that's partly a consequence of directed policy. So it's linked to the idea that there's something wrong with masculinity, and so that the expression of masculinity should be limited in all sorts of arbitrary ways. The fact that kids can't really play at schools anymore is a manifestation of that. The fact that male behavior is often diagnosed as attention deficit disordered, for example, is a manifestation of that. The elimination of competition as a valid form of human interaction, and the failure to recognize that competitive sports, for example, are deeply cooperative in their fundamental nature, as long as everyone is playing by the rules, obviously.
ADHD seems like an epidemic among today's young. I am a baby boomer, and I don't remember this phenomenon when I was a kid. Was it invented after I grew up, or have digital media maybe contributed to the problem?
Well, like I was saying, digital media affects the way your brain is formed and those neural pathways. So absolutely, it can affect your attention span.
Now, some schools are clamping down on this. They're forbidding their health offices from prescribing ADHD medications, or only prescribing them if students agree to have their parents notified. But according to the experts in this story, you guys, those schools are pretty few and far between.
This is just part of this competitive, to succeed at any cost.
It's like doping in sports. The more people do it, the more everyone has to do it to get ahead. Hard to roll back.
You can go up to the second floor of the library and see, a full wing of people just cracked out.
Are people doing lines of Adderall in the library?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I've seen it multiple times.
Just openly in the library?
Yes.
Yeah.
People will blow lines down of just Adderall.
In the high-pressure rat race of academic achievement, there is one fix students are turning to at an alarming rate to get ahead. Some call it academic doping, and experts say it has a very real and largely ignored dark side. The Craigs believe there's a link.
A dear friend of Kyle's wrote about him after his passing, and he said, if Adderall can change someone like Kyle, then it can probably change any young person.
In schools at every level, boys account for the overwhelming majority of discipline cases. One study found that fully 1 in 5 high school boys had been diagnosed with some form of hyperactivity disorder. That's compared with just 1 in 11 girls. Many of them were medicated for it. The long-term health effects of those medications, not fully understood, but they do appear to include depression in later life.
I had this client, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I spent 20 hours a week for 25 years listening to people tell me about their lives, you know, and those people were people who were just barely hanging on to the bottom of the world, up to people who were so successful you can hardly believe it, like the entire gamut of people. And that's been absolutely fascinating. It's like being a clinical psychologist, if you really listen, is like being immersed in a Dostoevsky novel all the time, you know, because it's amazing what people will tell you if you listen to them. People are so interesting if you actually listen to them because they're so peculiar, they're like penguins or rhinoceroses or ostriches, they're unlikely creatures. And anyways, with regards to comparing yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today, this old client of mine, he was about 85 when he came to see me, and he was a financier and a kind of a mathematical genius. He made these little pendants out of a mathematical symbol for the most beautiful mathematical equation that was ever written. He made them out of gold, and he would hand those out. And he had studied psychology as a young man, and he introduced me to this concept that I didn't know about called the Pareto distribution. It's really important to know this. It's another fundamental fact, the knowledge of which can sort of transform the way you conceptualize, let's say, the political landscape. And this actually turns out to be a rather ironclad rule. It applies across very, very many situations. It applies, for example, to the mass of stars and the size of cities. So you can see how universal it is as a law. And it's something like those that have more get more, and those that have less get less. That's the Matthew principle, right? To those who have everything, more will be given. From those who have nothing, everything will be taken away. And the economists sometimes call that the Matthew principle. And so what that lays out is a world that's rife with inequality. So, you know, you hear this idea that I think it's the 85 richest people in the world have more money than the bottom 2 billion. That's a Pareto distribution phenomena. And you might say, to hell with capitalism for producing that. It's like, sorry, you got your diagnosis wrong. It's a natural law. It's no matter what society you study, you get a Pareto distribution of wealth. And it's partly because as you start to become successful, let's say, people offer you more and more opportunities. And as you start to fail, people move away from you and you plummet. And so, okay, so that's rough. So what it means is that there is always a landscape of inequality. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do anything about it, although I am saying that we don't know what to do about it. That's the thing, you know, because you can modify the Pareto distribution of wealth, let's say, but we don't know how to do it without maybe disrupting the system so completely that it collapses, which is what happened in the Soviet Union, for example, and in Maoist China. They were trying, at least in principle, to adjust inequality. But the cure was far worse than the disease. And the truth of the matter is we actually don't know technically how much inequality there has to be to generate wealth. So there is inequality. What that means is there's always going to be people around that are better at something than you are. And that's a problem, because you can get jealous and you can get bitter and you can get resentful, and worse, you can get hopeless, you know. How could I conceive of my life so that if I had that life, it would clearly be worth living, so I wouldn't have to be bitter, resentful, deceitful, arrogant, and vengeful? Like, that's sort of the bottom line, right? Because that's what endless failure does to you. It's not good. And that's what life without purpose and a goal does to you as well. And this is another issue that pertains to the dignity and importance of the individual. How you conduct yourself in your life is way more important than you think. And I mean, I think that that's a daunting idea, because, you know, let's say you're nihilistic and life is meaningless. Well, what's the payoff for that? You think, well, there's no payoff. It's like, well, yeah, there is. You have no responsibility. That's a pretty decent payoff. I mean, you have to pay the price of meaninglessness, but it doesn't matter what you do. Well, we'll flip that over and say, no, sorry, you're wrong. Your life is meaningful. It's way more meaningful than you think, but you have to bear responsibility for your thoughts and your actions. It's like, there'll be plenty of meaning in that. Well, that if you understand that properly, that will cleave you to the depths of your soul, and maybe you learn to speak carefully and to act carefully, and that will have a beneficial effect on everyone around you. You're far more powerful in the place you stand, in the place you sit and stand than you think. And I think everyone has an intimation of that. And if you don't think that's true, then try treating people around you as if it's not true. Try treating people that you know in your life as if they don't matter. And just see what kind of response you get. People are not going to be happy with you, not in any sense whatsoever. You'll ruin all your relationships. You have to treat people as if they matter. And maybe you have to treat them as if they matter because maybe they do. And that goes for you too. And so if you matter, then you should act like you matter. And that's a very daunting proposition, that's for sure.
It's an honor to have you, Professor.
A darling of cable conservatives.
And that's a much bigger risk. So
yes, it is.
With an almost religious following online, clinical psychologist Jordan B. Peterson has become something of a rock star in the crusade against political correctness.
Free speech is the mechanism by which we keep our society functioning.
The Canadian professor rising to fame in 2016 for opposing changes to the country's anti-discrimination laws.
I think this legislation is reprehensible.
Changes that effectively made it illegal not to call a trans person by their preferred gender pronoun, like ze or they.
I'd like to encourage people struggling with this to be kind as their first impulse.
Kindness is the excuse that social justice warriors use when they want to exercise control over what other people think and say.
Is being sensitive to offence such a problem, though? Like, we would have previously called that manners.
It's a terrible problem. So imagine you, okay, so the rule is you can't offend anyone, all right? Let's say you're speaking to one person, I can't offend you. All right, fair enough. What if I'm speaking to 10 people? Do I get to offend 1 in 10? How about 1 in 100? How about 1 in 1,000? You're going to come out on stage and you're going to say something important about something vital, and you're not going to offend 1 person in 1,000? Well, you can't say anything about anything important ever without offending probably the person you're talking to. Important speech about important issues, especially contentious issues, is instantly offensive.
Well, when you go on the Golden Globes, a lot of time you are politically incorrect and hilarious, of course.
Thank you.
And so,
Thank you.
So this is,
well,
yeah,
well, that's the thing about offence, isn't it? When people say they're offended, it's that just because you're offended, it doesn't mean you're right. You know, it's offence is about feelings, and feelings are personal. With comedy as well, I think you've got to deal with taboos and contentious issues, and sometimes you deal in irony, and some people don't get that. But you can't legislate against stupidity, otherwise you'll be doing nothing.
Part of what's going to happen is that people are going to stop coming and speaking on campuses. The comedians in the United States, many of them already won't come and do their shows on campus because everybody's so sensitive to offense.
So what mistakes do you think we're making as a society to produce an ever-increasing number of young men like this?
That's a good question. I think we underestimate the necessity for young people to have clear direction and a sense of purpose in their life. They need something to offset the tragedy and malevolence of life. And we need to take these sorts of philosophical and even religious issues seriously, but we don't.
So if you, in the book, you have a number of these rules, and Rule 5 just jumped out at me as a father. You said, here's a rule: don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. What does that mean?
Well, it means, first of all, that you should understand that you are actually capable of disliking your children, and that because you're larger and more powerful than them, if you let them misbehave in a way that makes you dislike them, you're going to take revenge on them in a very bad way, and sometimes over decades. I've seen that as a clinical psychologist.
I could never dislike my children. It's like, yeah, well, those are the people who produce the most monstrous children, too, I can tell you that. So and then there's this idea that Jung had, which I really love, which is the idea of the shadow. And you know, it kind of got pop psychology and trendy, sort of among the New Age types too. But one thing I can tell you about Carl Jung is, no matter what else someone might say about him, he is absolutely not New Agey. If you read Carl Jung and you understand him and you're not terrified right to the depths of your soul, you haven't understood a damn thing you've read. And one of the things that Jung said about the shadow, which is the dark side of humanity, the dark side of each individual, was that its roots reached all the way to hell. And he meant something very specific, both metaphysical and practical by that. The metaphysical element was he meant hell, literally and metaphysically, but he also meant the more proximal kinds of hell. And so what he meant was that if you were able to understand your dark side, then you would see in yourself a reflection of the behavior that was present at Auschwitz, for example. And that the reason that people don't take the dark side of themselves seriously at all, and even confront the fact that it exists, is because no one wants to see that reflected within them. And no wonder, like it's absolutely no wonder. Jung also believed that that confrontation with the shadow was an inevitable barrier to enlightenment, that there was no, you know, Joseph Campbell, who is a popularizer of Jung to some degree, has become well known for saying, follow your bliss. And you know, Campbell learned virtually everything he knew from Jung, but Jung, that isn't what Jung said at all. He said, pursue what's meaningful and you'll encounter that which you least want to encounter. And that's the dragon, right? That's the dragon that hoards gold, for example. And the dragon is also something that lives inside you, and it's not something that you take the encounter with lightly. There are very old stories about this. There's this Egyptian story about the god Horus, who was the Egyptian savior in some sense. And when he encountered evil, even though he was a god, he lost an eye in the battle. And so that's the famous Egyptian eye, you know, that everyone still knows about. That's the eye of Horus that was torn out by Seth, who's the precursor to Satan. And so it's no joke, that. It's no joke.
So those are the numbers, and they paint a very clear picture. American men are failing in body, in mind, and in spirit. This is a crisis. And of course, if you live in this country, you've just seen a horrifying series of mass shootings, far more than we've ever had. Women didn't do that. In every case, the shooter was a man. Something ominous is happening to men in America. Everyone who pays attention knows that. What's odd is how rarely you hear it publicly acknowledged. Here are the numbers. Start with the most basic, life and death. The average American man will die 5 years before the average American woman. One of the reasons for this is addiction. Men are more than twice as likely as women to become alcoholics. They're also twice as likely to die of a drug OD. In New Hampshire, one of the states hardest hit by the opioid crisis, 73% of overdose deaths were men. But the saddest reason for shortened lifespans is suicide. 77% of all suicides in America are committed by men. The overall rate is increasing at a dramatic pace. Between 1997 and 2014, there was a 43% rise in suicide deaths among middle-aged Americans.
I want my kids looking in a casket.
Están peleando con un enemigo muy grande que se llama dinero.
We are getting drug dealers off the street. At least this way we can say we are making a difference.
We all think addiction and drugs, it's not my neighborhood. And the reality is it is. This stuff is everywhere.
Now, a new documentary series showcases the pain and the many effects of the nation's opioids crisis. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported yesterday that emergency room visits for suspected opioid overdoses were up 30% compared with the year before. The series puts a human face on this crisis.
The series is called The Trade.
I never thought that I would ever be like this, that I would continue to do something that would kill me.
Get out of my house! And explores the opioid crisis in 5 parts and from multiple perspectives. The cartels growing poppies and producing heroin in the Mexican highlands.
Cualquiera que la pruebe, no dejan de pedir. Nos hace como Superman.
Sheriff's office, search warrant! drug enforcement agents trying to stem the flow of heroin and synthetic opioids into Ohio.
And I want to add that this opioid epidemic is the worst drug crisis in U.S. history. In 2016, there were over 60,000 overdoses, and also there's as many deaths from overdoses as there are deaths to car crashes. So it's a major problem that we're seeing all around.
Well, the extent of WA's drug crisis is most evident in our courts, with a staggering surge in drug crimes in recent years. Offences for dealing, manufacturing and possessing drugs have risen by a staggering 107% in the past decade. And how does WA compare to other states, John?
Well, I'm not sure what the stats are as between the states, but what I do know, as Linda has said, is it's getting worse in Western Australia, and I understand it's getting worse everywhere.
I just give them money to get out of here.
When people think of addiction, they often think of what it does to the individual addict, but so often it ravages not just the mind and the body of that person, but the family, communities. And that storyline with the Waltons is really seen through the eyes of his mother, Jen.
Far fewer young men get married than did just a few decades ago, and fewer stay married. About 1 in 5 American children live now only with their mothers. That's double the rate of 1970. Millions more boys growing up without fathers.
In Morning Live, as we continue with a discussion on the spiraling out of moral compass of South Africa, we've spoken about where the nation is at this current moment.
Well, as you know, morals, that is the standards and the principles according to which we conduct our lives and make our decisions according to those values. But the parents have to start with instilling those values, but they do so by leading by example. If children, when they see parents drinking too much, for example, they might do the same.
Today, our children, they are parented by media, your cell phone, your gadgets and all these things. Nobody's parenting them. And at the end of the day, we get surprised when we have a monster in the house because the parents, they were not there. And now these boys and these girls have turned into something else. How do you explain an issue of a child who just take a book and then smack at the teacher?
Yeah.
Where are the parents? Where are the parents? I would love to hear the statement from the parents, because these are the things that we need to deal with, because if we don't deal with them in a private space, they will expose us in a public space.
Yeah. And this is really a huge issue for young people. First Lady Melania Trump meeting with tech leaders at the White House Tuesday as part of her initiative to combat online bullying.
But the days that she went to school, those 8 hours she'd spend, she'd be isolated and manipulated and
not
demoralized.
listened
more than
to.
anything, demoralized.
Her parents say it began on social media. Now, the Greens told me they hope to see a curriculum change in schools. They said in addition to math and science and English classes, they hope we can teach our kids about empathy and kindness and life skills that are so important to the socialization of schools.
Yeah, and they make such a great point, Amy, in that we learn about being kind to one another in kindergarten. A simple lesson like that, but we never hear about it again.
That's right. They want it from kindergarten all the way to 12th grade. Every child should be reminded that kindness matters.
We can use it in adulthood, too.
Yes, we could.
Right, Aim?
Yes.
You were great with those parents.
Thank you.
I mean, there's no shortage of suffering and malevolence in life, and it's easy for people to become embittered by that. And if they don't see a way out, see a way forward, they get angry about it and turn against life itself. And they make a display of their hatred for being by massacring the innocent. That's what's happening. And they write that.
They do write that. It's accelerating.
Yes.
What I've done with these rules is they're very simple rules, and they're kind of comical and tongue-in-cheek in some ways. But what I've tried to do is pull them apart and show what's underneath them, and to go down as deep as I possibly can. And in Rule 2, it's a bit of a meditation on why people don't like themselves very much. And I think there's 2 reasons, really. And one is that we're fragile and damageable and imperfect in multiple dimensions all the time. And that often just gets worse. It's a real existential question for people. It's like, why the hell should you take care of something as sorry and wretched as you are? And that's really what the chapter is about. You're, first of all, yes, you're pretty useless and terrible, but so is everyone else, and that's actually an existential problem, right? And what I mean by that, it's a problem that every human being has always had and always will. So it's not just you. It's a universal problem. And that there's an answer to that. And one of them is to, what is it to say? Love the sinner but hate the sin. It's something like that. More than that, it's a discussion of why you have a moral obligation to do that. It's not just that you should because it would be better for you. You actually have a moral obligation to do that, I think, because you make the world a much better place, a much worse place if you don't take care of yourself. That's the thing about being an individual. It's the thing that Western civilization has always recognized, that as an individual, you have a light that you have to bring into the world, and that if you don't bring it into the world is a dimmer place, and that's a bad thing, because when the world is a dim place, it can get very, very, very dark. And so it's necessary, not just so that you feel better, not just so that you're a #1 lobster, none of those things. You need to take care of yourself because you're in the best position to do that. And it's necessary for you to take care of yourself. Despite the fact that we're mortal and vulnerable and self-conscious and capable, not only capable of doing terrible things, but actually do them. Despite all that, you still have that responsibility.
What is a psychological profile of somebody who bombs people?
So the research has shown when it comes to serial, we're looking at bombing, whether it's killing, harming, bombing, serial. The concept is that somewhere there is a void within this person, and they believe that this action will correct whatever the problem is that they are experiencing.
And chapter 6 is it's a rough chapter. I spend a lot of time reading about totalitarianism and about atrocity, like some many, many brutal things, brutal beyond the capacity of imagination even. And I read a lot about individual criminals and serial killers and those sorts of people too, trying to get to the bottom. One book I would really recommend is a book by Karl Panzram, which is an autobiography. Panzram is the name of the book. And he was a rough guy, man. It's about Panzram. And it's about the Columbine kids, the kids who shot up the high school, because I read their diaries, and I understood them too, which is even better than just reading them. And you see these mass shootings all the time, and everyone does the same thing. Oh, how did that happen? Why did that happen? How can it be this way? It's like, well, why don't you read what they said about why they did it, and just assume that that's the reason. Oh, they must have been bullied. Oh yes, because the natural response of anyone who's been bullied is to go arm yourself to the teeth to plot the destruction of the entire city. I think it was of Detroit, to line your entire high school avenue with bombs and then to go and shoot your classmates. That's what happens when you're bullied. It's like, no, that's not what happens when you're bullied. That's a stupid explanation. It's shallow beyond belief. And it really emerges only because people don't want to contend with the real issue. And the Columbine kids, well, they were contending with the real issue. They basically said quite forthrightly that in their own arrogant estimation, being itself was corrupt and unnecessary, and it would be best if it was eradicated in the most brutal possible way as fast as possible. The Columbine guys, who had their ups and downs, but nothing compared to Karl Panzram, say, were judges of being and decided that it was flawed and that they were the ones to set it right. And so it's a rough chapter, but it's more than that. It's a meditation on resentment, because resentment is a key human motivation.
Why is it all boys?
Well, boys are more aggressive than girls, and there's a biological component to that that's quite strong. That's why the vast majority of people in prison are male. Like on average, there's not much difference in aggression between men and women. If you picked a random woman and a random man out of the population and you had to bet on who was the most aggressive, if you bet it was the woman, you'd be right 40% of the time. But if you take the 1 in 100 most aggressive people, and those would be the people in prison, they're all men, or virtually all men. It's also why males attempt suicide less frequently, but they commit it successfully much more frequently. They're much more likely to use lethal means. And there's a very powerful biological component to that, despite what the postmodern social constructionists have to say about it. But they've got their head firmly buried in the sand, so.
Yeah, no, they're resistant to the evidence and reality. We know that.
I mean, people are even talking about deciding on what gender they're going to be as youngsters.
Yeah, well, that's happening all over. It's an absolute epidemic, and we've decided that children as young as 3 or 4 can now decide what gender they are, and then undergo the appropriate surgical and biological alterations to bring their morphology in keeping with that. And it's a mistake of epic proportions, and we're going to pay for it in a big way.
Either way, ignoring the decline of men does not help anyone. Men and women need each other. One cannot exist without the other. That is elemental biology. It's also the reality that each one of us has lived with our parents and siblings and friends. Yet our leaders pretend it's not happening. And in fact, they tell us the opposite is true. Women are victims. Men are oppressors. To question that assumption is to risk punishment. When men fail, all of us suffer. How did this happen?
I studied history for the duration of my degree, and I think it's just sickeningly ironic that the people who are using their free speech want to take away your free speech, and furthermore, that they can't see the irony of the situation of how tyrannical they're being. My question is, however, I've noticed from a lot of what you've talked about, and I've been watching you since your rise in 2016, and I know that you're a Christian, and I don't want to divulge into that, but I notice a lot of the sort of North American Protestant work ethic in your lessons, like, you know, self-redemption and to be your own person. Like, we've been talking about that for the last, like, hour and a half, I suppose. And in an ever-rising tide where people are, or rather in the Western world where it's becoming increasingly, or rather decreasingly Christian, and specifically, decreasingly religious and specifically decreasingly Christian, how can you, what do you think is the best suggestion in order to be able to uphold those such important values that have been across the world from American cultural influence since the end of the Second World War? I apologize for the long question.
No, it's fine. You know, people have asked me repeatedly about my religious views, and I've answered them in a variety of different ways, but they say, do you believe in God, let's say? And my response to that always is, well, I don't know what you mean when you ask me that question, so I don't know how to answer it. I don't know what you mean by believe, but I can tell you something that I believe. And I would say this is a way of speaking symbolically. I do believe, so I was thinking the other day, a week ago, I was thinking about this, I had this little fantasy that entered my mind. I was thinking about St. Joseph's Oratorio in Montreal. And St. Joseph's Oratorio is a very large religious building. It's one of the biggest cathedral-like structures in the world, and it's set on the hill on Mount Royal, and it's set up where it can catch the sun. You know, so it's an image of the heavenly city on the hill, right? It's an image of the structures that we strive to create. That's what it is, independent of its specifically Christian or religious function. That's what it stands for symbolically. Okay, so it's the city on the hill. It's what we're striving towards when we walk uphill. And you struggle up the hill towards the kingdom of God. That's what you do. Because the alternative is to descend into the abyss. That's the alternative. And then so to say, well, do you believe? It's like, I believe that you should struggle uphill towards the city of God on your crutches. That's what you should do. That's the opposite of the descent into the abyss. And so that's at the foundation of our civilization, that idea. And I'll close with this, and it's a good way to close. You know, and this is a psychological observation. The central figure of Western culture is Christ. And we can look at that psychologically, because Christ is the dying and resurrecting hero. And what does that mean psychologically? Well, it means that you learn things painfully. And when you learn something painfully, a part of you has to die. That's the pain. You know, when a dream is shattered, for example, a huge part of you that constituted that dream, maybe even the biological substrate of that dream, has to be stripped away and burned. And so, life is a constant process of death and rebirth. And to participate in that fully is to allow yourself to be redeemed by it. And so the good is that process of death and rebirth, voluntarily undertaken. It's like you're not as good as you could be, so you let that part of you die. And if someone comes along and says, you know, there's some dead wood here, man, it needs to be burned off. You think, well, that stuff's still a bit alive. When that burns, it's going to hurt. It's like, yeah, well, no kidding. But maybe the thing that emerges in its place is something better. And I think this is the secret of human beings. This is what we're like, you know. Unlike any other creature, is that we can let our old selves die and let our new selves be born. And that's what we should do. And so, where do I fall short in these 12 rules? Well, endlessly. Because, well, here's a way of thinking about it. Until the entire world is redeemed, we all fall short. And that's probably a good place to stop.